Hi, this is Catherine with Enfolded Heart Music. Welcome back to Lyre Foundations. Today we're going to be continuing our chapter 4 by looking at lesson 5, which is entitled Roadmap Notations. This has to do with things like repeats, multiple endings, and different ways in which sometimes there's little shortcuts that are written into music. It's very helpful to know how to read that if it's something that you come across. So we're going to do that today, and hopefully it will be of help for you. So let's jump in. All right, just as a general overview first, we are starting on page 67, and we are going to be taking a look at a couple of things. The first is just different kinds of bar lines. Then we'll look at repeat signs, multiple endings, and then what's probably the trickiest ones are the DC al Coda, DC alfine, DS alfine, and, oh, I missed one, DS al Coda. Once we've gone through that, you can take a look at there's like a little practice quiz to help make sure that you understand how that actually works. But let us go ahead and jump in by just talking about bar lines and also repeat signs. Let's do that first. Okay, so looking first at page 67. We probably won't be using the lyre too much today because it really doesn't have a lot to do with the lyre in particular, but we'll see. Maybe it'll come in handy in a little bit. But page 67, looking at different kinds of bar lines. So we have our normal bar line, which we talked about before, which divides the music up into measures. So we're not going to go over that. But there's three more that I'd like to introduce you to today. The first is what's called a final bar line. And this is where you have a thicker bar line next to the right of a just normal thin bar line. So there's two bars, one is thicker than the other. This indicates that you've reached the end of the piece. And now this might sound a little silly because you might think, well, won't I know that I've reached the end of the piece because there's no more music? Most of the time, yes, but other times it's actually not the case because the composer wants you to play through a certain part and then go back and repeat something and end in the middle of the piece. Of course, it will sound like the end, but you'll end in the middle of the piece. And it's just a way to write in a more abbreviated fashion so that, for example, the composer doesn't have to write, maybe there's a whole page of music they want you to go back and repeat. Instead of adding that music at the end and having a whole extra page, they just basically draw an arrow, in a certain sense, back to the beginning so that you know that that's what they want you to play again. So when you see the thick bar line to the right of the thin one, that means that's where you stop. That's the end of the piece. In contrast to that, we have what's called a double bar line, where you have two bar lines, but they're the same thinness. So neither one of them is thick. This can indicate a couple of different things. Mostly, there's a certain break or division in the piece. Maybe it's a different movement, things like that. It kind of can vary. But just so you know that if you see two that are thin next to each other, it is not the end of the piece. It's rather the end of a particular section or particular part. Only when we have that thick one. Okay, continuing to move down, we have repeat signs. And this looks like a final bar line in addition to having two little dots. Now the dots can be on either side of the bar line. It just depends on what section it's telling you to actually repeat it. So looking at this example on page 67, what you'll notice is that the dots sort of point into, they kind of bookend the section that you're supposed to repeat. You only repeat it once, so you'll play it a total of 2 times. So for example, we would play, this little number indicates we're starting at measure 24. We'd play measure 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Once we've finished playing measure 29, we're going to go back and start again at measure 27 because we see that's where the first repeat sign is. And then we'll again go ahead and play 27, 28. Oop, I said that wrong. I apologize. 26 to measure 26. So let me start again. You'll play measure 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Then you'll go back to measure 26. I just miscounted. And you'll play 26, 27, 28, 29. Once you've played it that second time, then you will continue with measure 30, 31 in the rest of the piece. Okay? You will almost always see 2 repeat signs, because you have to know where you're starting and where you're ending that repeated section. The only time that this is not the case is if they want you to go back to the beginning of the piece. So for example, you might see what looks like the second repeat sign here. You might see that maybe, 5 measures into the piece, just taking a random example. If you see that and you don't see the other half of the repeat sign at the beginning of the piece, you can assume, I need to go back and play those first 5 measures again before moving on to measure 6. Okay. Let's go ahead actually and continue. Since this is kind of going a little speedy, let's go ahead and do the multiple endings. So this is page 67 and 68. The visual is going to be on 68. Of course, it sort of goes without saying that I sort of assume that you either have read the paragraphs or that you will. They're there for a reason, and they explain what I'm saying with greater thoroughness. Same content-ish, but more thoroughness. So please do read that. Okay, so multiple endings. The way that this works is essentially if the composer has a section of the piece that they want you to play twice, except the first time and the second time are going to be slightly different at the end. This is very, very common in, for example, church music or church hymns, because you will, we read certain verses, right? Like we'll go through the tune multiple times, 3, 4, 5 times before we end. And when we get to the end of the verse or the end of that song, before we go back to the beginning, usually there's something that the musician will play to help indicate in the notes, in the tunes itself, that they want you to go back to the beginning. It sort of like leads into the beginning again. However, when you get to the very end of the song, when you've done all the verses that you need to do and you need to complete the song, you don't really want to play that same ending that you've been playing. You don't want to play that again because it sounds not like the end. It sounds like, oh, we're going to go back to the beginning. Sort of a little invitation to go back to the beginning. So instead of that, it will be indicated, it will be marked that you are to play a different ending, one that probably ends on the tonic note, something that gives the song a sense of rest and completion. It's probably the most common example, actually, I can think of, a common situation where you'll have multiple endings. It's definitely where I've encountered it the most. But anyways, also if you want to write your own music, it's a shorthand way to do that. So again, all of this that we're going into now, with the repeat sign, the multiple endings, and then the Codas and alphine and all that kind of stuff, are shorthand, so that you don't have to write so much music. You can just, again, sort of draw an arrow and indicate by these certain signs where you want the musician to go back to. Okay, so how does this work? Let's look at the images. So we're looking at the first one, this first example, and this has 2 different endings. And this would be an example where we have, we'll take the hymns as an example, just two different verses. And so what you would do is you would play just normally. You'd be coming in at measure 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Can I count? Let's see, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. There we go. 24, you have this little 1 over it. And that means you want to play this ending, whatever's under that bracket. It may not always be 1 measure. It may be 4 or 5 measures. You want to play that as the end to your first, we'll just call it the first verse. Once you have finished that, you see how there's little dots right there, so we see there's a repeat sign. So then you would go back to probably the beginning, but if not the beginning, then wherever the other half of the repeat sign is, you go back to that section, play the whole thing again. So in this circumstance, we would finish playing ending number 1, then we'd go back to measure 19. We play 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and since this is the second time we're playing it, you will skip over measure 24 and only play measure 25. This will be the end. We see that again with our ending bar line, our final bar line there, with the thick and then the thin, and that will be the end of the piece. Okay, a second example is indicated below, where you have, instead of 2 endings, you still have 2 different endings, but you have, for example, 3 verses. And I'll expand on this in a moment too. So you would do the same thing that we did in example 1, except that you would play that first ending twice. So we'd play measures 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Then we would go back to 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So this is the second time we're playing that first ending. And we'd go back a third time, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, skip over this first option, and go instead to number 3, which is measure 18, and play that to end the piece. Okay? Sometimes the area where it says 1 period, 2 period, you can also see things like 1-4, for example. That is probably more common of what you would see in hymns, because usually you're not going to just have 2 verses. You're probably not even going to have 3, just in case it's a particularly long song or particularly a long time that you need to be playing that song. And so it's basically saying, okay, play this first ending for all the verses except for the very last one, and then you want to play number 3 or whatever it may be. So you had 1 through 4 for the first ending, then 5 would be the second ending. So that's how that works. So it's kind of putting the repeat signs in a different kind of context, and just a really helpful option for giving the composer and whoever's printing those books and all that kind of stuff just a little bit of a more concise and precise way to communicate that. Okay, now let's take a break there before we get into the next part. Make sure you understand that pretty clearly, and then we'll come back and really just kind of finish up this chapter or this lesson. Okay, let's look now at something a little bit different. Now, these are not complicated in and of themselves, but they are easy to confuse with one another. So let me say that again. It's not a complicated concept, because it's really just telling you what measure to go back to, which measure to repeat, but it is easy to mix them up. So make sure that you're clear on each one. There's 4 of them. Make sure you're clear on each one of those before you move forward. Otherwise, I'm afraid it would lead to, again, just some greater confusion. Okay, so the first one. We're looking at DC al coda. DC stands for da capo, which means from the head, like from the top. And so this means you're going to go back to the beginning of the piece. I find that very helpful to remember the da capo part. Okay, so let's do this with examples first. We're looking at the example on page 68. So the way that this works is that you're playing along your piece, going along, playing it just like normal from left to right. When you hit the coda, which sometimes it will say coda, sometimes it will have the symbol of the coda, sometimes it will have both. Most times it has both, but it just kind of depends. Once you hit that, which will come right after, it actually will say DC al coda. So you kind of have two different things here. You'll hit DC al coda, which is in measure, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, measure 7. So you'll play measures 1 through 7. Once you get there, you will go back da capo to the beginning, and then you will play until you reach something that says to coda. So again, we've played measures 1 through 7. We go back to the beginning. Then we play measure 1, 2, and essentially 3. Then we see that it tells us to go to the coda. Once we hit that, instead of continuing forward, we will go, as it says, to the coda. Now the coda, which is a little bit hard to show in this example, is almost always at the very, very end of the piece. It's sort of like an alternative ending, except that you're skipping over a certain part of your music in order to get there. Okay? So let's go through this one more time. If you see DC al coda, you're going to play until you hit DC al coda. That's the first sign you're looking for. You go back to the beginning until you see to coda, or just the coda sign. Once you see that, you will not play whatever is after that. You will instead skip to the coda part, which also is indicated either by the coda sign or by the word coda, or both. And then you will play, and that will be the end of the piece. The coda is always going to be at the end. It's sort of the final part. And that's DC al coda. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is DS al coda. So DS stands for, let's see if I can say it, disegno, which just means from the sign. So one is from the head, one is from the sign. So it's the same idea, except instead of going to the beginning, you're going to go back to the sign. Okay? So, excuse me. And the sign is literally called a segno sign. So that's why it makes sense to say from the sign or disegno. All right. So looking at this example now on the top of page 69. So again, we're playing our piece. We're doing great. Going measures 1 through 7. We see DS al coda. Now we need to know where that segno is, so we know where to go back to. We can see there's this little sign above, in between measures 2 and 3. So that means we're going to go back, instead of from the top or from the beginning, we're going to go back to the segno, the sign, and start in measure 3. We'll play measures 3, 4, and 5, and then we see to coda, and just like we did before, we go then to the coda and play until the end of the piece. So one more time for this one. We play measures 1 through 7. We see DS al coda. We must know where the sign is. We go back to the sign. This is measure 3. Then we play measures 3, 4, and 5 until we see to coda, and there we play the rest of the piece. We play the coda till the end. Okay, so that's 2. Those are the coda ones. All right, the other 2, I'm sorry. Yes, those are the coda ones. Okay. We then have DC alfine. Okay. Again, DC meaning da capo, from the head. But instead of going back and then moving to a coda, you will go until you see the word fine, or the end, basically. Okay, this is a really good example of needing to know what that final bar line looks like, because you need to be able to find that and indicate that in the piece. Okay, so this example on page 69 is the second example. What you will do is you'll play from the beginning of the piece all the way until you see DC alfine, which is just that whole section. So measures 1 through 11. DC, so this is the first part. The DC or the DS tells us where we're going back to. The alfine or al coda tells us what we're doing after that. So DC to capo, from the beginning, from the top, from the head. We go back to the beginning, and we simply play until we see the double bar line, the final bar line with the word fine right there, and that means the end. Okay? So again, we play measures 1 through 11, and we see a double bar line there. This is a very good place in which you would see it. And it's because we're not actually ending the piece at the end of the measures, we're ending it in the middle of the piece. We go back to the beginning and then play until we see that final bar line. Okay, that's the third one. The fourth one now is DS alfine. So same idea, except instead of going back from the beginning, we're going to find the segno sign and then play to the end. So in this last example, we again play measures 1 through 11 until we see DS alfine. So DS now, instead of from the top or from the head, we'll go and find the sign, the segno, which is same place I had it before, which is the beginning of measure 3, and then we'll play until we hit the end of the piece where we see that final bar line and the word fine. So that will be, excuse me, measures 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So those are the 4 different kinds. Let me very briefly review that again. If you see DC, that means go back to the beginning. If you see al coda, that means you're going to play until you see to coda, and then you'll go to the end of the piece and play coda. If you see alfine, that means you're going to be going back not to a coda. You'll go back either to the beginning or to the sign, but rather than going to a coda, you'll end in the middle of the piece where you see that final bar line and the word fine. Okay, that is everything actually for this lesson. So again, let me pause and have a few concluding comments, and then we will wrap it up from there. Okay, once you have done that, again, make sure you're clear between the difference in all of those, and then you can take this little practice quiz that I've written up to help make sure that you haven't confused any of them, and that you make sure really where you should be going if you see one of those signs. I've got the answers on page 71. And certainly if you've got access to a lot of sheet music, sometimes people have a lot of books, that they've been given or handed down or something like that. I would encourage you to kind of flip through it and see if you can find any of these in there. Just a helpful way to integrate that information in just more and more creative ways. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Next time we're going to be, I think it's finishing the chapter. Let's see. We're going to be doing lesson 6. Yeah, this is the end of chapter 4. It's a big chapter, chapter 4. We'll be ending that with notations for dynamics and articulation. So it'll also be pretty brief, but helpful information so that you know what things look like. And then from there, you can work on playing them in that particular way. So as always, if you have any questions or if I can be of any additional help to you, please let me know. And I will do my best to answer questions and to share what knowledge I have. Thank you so much. I hope it's been helpful for you, and may God bless you. May the peace of Christ be with you. Thank you again.